So basically, if I understand the logic correctly, it's, let's say in the here and now, if I commit myself to improving the lives of the people around me, let's say I have a 50-50 shot of improving the lives of 10 or 20 people, versus I commit myself to building something new that might allow for a kind of technological advancement that would lead to a further human flourishing, and I have a 0.1% chance of succeeding. But if I were to succeed, I would improve the lives of 10 trillion people. On the whole, the latter probabilistically, consequentially seems like the better use of my time. Do I have that right?
That's exactly right. Crunch the numbers. So you use, this thing called expected value theory to that enables you to navigate situations in which you have an array of actions that you could take, and there's uncertainty about the results. So in this case, you might invest in trying to create this technology. Maybe you'll probably fail, but if you succeed, the payoff is going to be huge. And so even if there's a low probability of success, if the payoff is big enough, then the expected value may still be very high. So yes, that's exactly the line of reasoning that leads the long-termists to say global poverty, yes, it's very bad. Everybody agrees about that. But what's much worse is the non-existence of all of these future people, in millions, billions, trillions of years from now in vast computer simulations.
So how did you come across long-termism? Tell me a little bit about where your journey through these ideas begins.
So initially, well, maybe the first thing to say is that, long-termism is a word that was coined in 2017. But the idea goes back really to the early aughts, perhaps even a little bit before that, in the work of Nick Bostrom. So my initial, and at first the central aim of long-termism is really to reduce existential risk, where existential risk is any event that would prevent us from creating some kind of utopian world among the stars with astronomical numbers of people. And so this idea of existential risk goes back to 2002 in some of Nick Bostrom's work, and hence the basic idea of long-termism dates back there as well. So anyway, so I initially got introduced to the notion of existential risk through the idea of transhumanism. And existential risk was initially defined specifically in transhumanist terms as just any event that would prevent us from realizing the transhumanist project of radically enhancing ourselves and thereby creating this techno-utopian world in the future. Excuse me. And yeah, so at first I found transhumanism to be quite alarming. So in order to realize the transhumanist project, it's necessary to develop various technologies, emerging technologies like nanotechnology, synthetic biology, genetic engineering, and advanced artificial intelligence. Those are technologies, those are the vehicles to get us from where we are now to this techno-utopian world of post-humans. And it turns out that these technologies seem to carry greater risks with them than any technologies we've ever created before. Perhaps they're much riskier than nuclear weapons, for example. One reason that would be is not only are they extremely powerful. For example, synthetic biology could enable us to create designer pathogens that are far more transmissible and far more lethal than any kind of pathogenic microorganism that would naturally evolve in the wild. Because in nature, there tends to be a trade-off. But in the laboratory, perhaps you could combine these in ways that, there's this very deadly germ that spreads as easily as the common cold. And so, so they're very powerful on the one hand. On the other hand, they also seem to be extremely accessible. And so whereas in order to build a nuclear weapon, you need, a lot of scientists. You're dealing with uranium or plutonium, which is a very dangerous material. But and also you have to ensure that uranium, plutonium is is weapons grade, which is very, very difficult. So with these, pathogens, for example, this is, they're self-replicating, so all you need is one to start with. And it could be the case that this technology is accessible in a way that nuclear weapons aren't to small groups and even single individuals. So by virtue of the fact that suddenly you could have an enormous number of non-state actors who have access to technologies capable that enable them to unilaterally destroy humanity, these technologies are very dangerous. Transhumanism says we need to develop these. If we don't, the transhumanist project will never succeed. But on the other hand, developing them runs the risk that these technologies will destroy the transhumanist project itself by perhaps destroying humanity. And so that was my initial introduction to this general area. At first I was very much a critic of it, but sort of realized that, or came to the conclusion, which I think is somewhat wrong now, that a lot of these technologies cannot be stopped. They're the enterprise of technologization is not something that has any break. So rather than try to fight the development of these technologies, one should sort of join the team,
right,
and see if you can sort of shape the way they're developed to make the future as safe as possible.
Because one of the Bostrom arguments, right, is that if we don't do it, sort of outlaws will, and therefore better to bring it into the fold than to forbid it, because there's no way to properly forbid it, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. So part of the argument is that actually, if you try to regulate it, if you try to impose broad moratoriums on entire fields of emerging science, what you're really going to do is just drive that science underground. And I'm not entirely sure that that is true, but that's sort of the argument.
That's the case,
actually, you'll make things more dangerous if you try to regulate it. So the best thing to do is then to just try to figure out ways of developing these technologies safely. Maybe there are safeguards you can kind of build into them. Perhaps there are external systems that you could create to prevent some sort of global scale catastrophe from happening. In the case of engineered pandemics, maybe there's pathogen kind of surveillance systems out there, and in an organization like the WHO.
So as you start to consider these transhumanist technologies, does that lead you into the arms of long-termism, essentially?
Yeah. So the idea of existential risk really is you could see it as the thing that connects the early transhumanism, the late 1990s, early 2000s, with long-termism later on. So it's because the idea is central to both transhumanism and long-termism. So over time, initially Bostrom thought, okay, an existential risk is any event that prevents us from creating this techno-utopian world of post-humanity. And then shortly after that, he realized, actually, there could be this, not just this techno-utopian world, but an enormous number of people in the future. And so, all of that would be enabled by technology as well. And it would be very bad if we failed to create these people, because on the particular ethical view that they accepted, could exist implies should exist. So if there are possible people in the far future who could exist, they should exist, and hence failing to create them would be some kind of moral tragedy. And so, this is how the idea of existential risk took shape. And then once you have the effective altruists discovering this idea and realize there could be a huge number of people in the future, the best way to do the most good is to focus on these far future people. This idea of existential risk becomes very, very important to them. Because again, any existential risk would just foreclose this vast and glorious future, to quote Toby Ord, one of the long-termists. So this is through transhumanism to existential risk leads directly to the long-termist ideology.
So you were studying. I'm just trying to get a sense of kind of situating you at this point. You're you're a PhD student, I mean, where are you sort of in the community? You're looking at existential risk, and then you're seeing long-termism going, oh boy, what happened here? Or like where are you kind of in the story?
Yeah, I mean, initially, I should say I was very much an advocate of this worldview
Mm-hmm.
and really took it seriously. Um, and me, my personal situation was a bit unusual, but is actually very relevant to how I got into the existential risk field. Uh, from starting 2009, what basically became an independent scholar for various reasons. And I just recently became a PhD student to finally get that last terminal degree. Um, but yeah, and so not being uh, associated in any official capacity with a university has its downsides, but also on the positive side, it sort of gave me the freedom or latitude to pursue, strange new interdisciplinary
Mm.
topics of scholarly inquiry. And so, existential risk is a very interdisciplinary. The field that's built up around it is very interdisciplinary, and doesn't really have a home even in philosophy departments. And so it was because I was an independent scholar that I sort of had the opportunity, the freedom to go and pursue this topic. So that's how that happened.
Hmm. And when do you start to raise questions about where you're going and where this field is going?
Yeah, I think it was really 2018 when I was working on a book that became part two of the forthcoming book. And the focus was the ethics of human extinction. And so for the first time, I really dove deep into the literature on the topic. It's not particularly huge, but it does overlap significantly with something called population ethics, which does have a very large literature. And yeah, so that sort of forced me to seriously think a bit deeper about the underlying philosophical foundation of the long-termist worldview. And the more I dug around, the more convinced I was that these foundations are actually really quite weak.
Hmm.
And so that was the initial reason that I began to question the robustness and the extent to which this view is compelling. And right, sort of, really is 2018 that I started to become concerned about it. Part of that was that I had read some of the writings, books and papers that had been published on apocalyptic terrorism and apocalypticism, and realized that a lot of these movements that went on to commit atrocities, to engage in violent acts, were motivated by ideologies that at their core contain the very same ingredients that long-termism contains at its core. And
Mm-hmm.
so it and also, I mean, I should mention many of the apocalyptic terrorist groups in the past began as very peaceful, explicitly peaceful. And they had a very passive kind of mode of trying to usher in the anticipated utopian world that they were looking forward to. And then there was some situation that triggered a switch to an active mode. And so the point being that even some of these movements that have a history of being nonviolent and so on can suddenly flip to becoming violent. What really matters is that there are those ingredients at the core of the ideology, and that's the case with long-termism. And hence, I became very concerned towards the end of 2019, for the first time, that long-termism could potentially justify, in the minds of true believers, acts that involve violence, that are aggressive, perhaps even, I don't think this is hyperbole to say, perhaps even genocidal. And so, yeah, that led me to become very worried about where the fact that this movement was becoming increasingly influential in the world.
How could it justify violence?
Yeah, good question. So, utilitarianism, this moral theory, has had a significant influence on long-termism. And utilitarianism says that the ends justify the means, right?
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, once you have this sort of ends justifying the means mode of moral reasoning, then and along with that, this view, which follows directly from it, that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with fraud, with lying, with even there's nothing intrinsically wrong about murder. All that matters are whether the consequences are maximize good, maximize value or not. And so when you pair that with this utopian vision of astronomical payoffs in the
Right.
far future, then suddenly you sort of have everything you need for somebody who really buys this view and really expects there to be this utopian world in the future, to engage in acts that to them seem justified insofar as those acts will increase the probability of realizing this techno-utopian future. So that's sort of that's why I think it's so dangerous.
And certainly the kinds of conclusions that they are reaching about the comparative worth of poor people, and the kind of eugenics looking conclusions suggests that something weird is happening for sure. I mean, but when you start asking these questions, first of all, I mean, presumably you didn't start with, "Hey guys, this could kind of justify genocide." I mean, how do you start asking those questions in those communities, and what are their reactions to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe one thing to say is I think there are two main dangers of long-termism. One is what we were just talking about. The other is the minimizing or neglecting of current day problems that are sub-existential. Because since realizing this, all this astronomical value in the future is what really matters. As a result of that, the most important task is to minimize existential risk more than anything else. So as a result, if global poverty is not an existential risk, it's going to end up lower down on the priorities list. Same with climate change. If climate change isn't going to cause our extinction or cause civilization to collapse in a way that's irrecoverable, then it's just not going to be a top priority.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that's the other danger, in addition to justifying these atrocities. So when I initially articulated this idea, the reaction was very hostile, and it resulted in a lot of quite tense debate, I think, within the community. I mean, frankly, a lot of people just stopped talking to me because they didn't want to believe that actually the ideology contains these ingredients that could be very, very dangerous. So ultimately, that just reinforced, to my mind, that this community, just on a sociological level, not only is there this sort of philosophical problem, but the community itself doesn't seem to be sufficiently receptive to criticisms or to an individual, warning that, look, there are structural parallels with the ideology of long-termism and these ideologies in the past that have proven to be very dangerous, and that as a result of that, we should take a step back and try to think seriously about whether or not it's really a good idea to be out there evangelizing for this sort of radical long-termist worldview. So it was not a positive reaction.
Yeah. I read some of the Bostrom papers, and one of the things that is in there is there's a certain sense of, at least rhetorically, of intellectual humility, where he writes about, oh, well, we can't know exactly what the right path is. So, for instance, people's sort of individual creative expression and freedom is important here. And so it has me thinking, in this sociologically and intellectually in this context, you might think, well, isn't there a chance we are wrong about something? And then therefore, on the long-termist view, that could have really dire long-term repercussions. So you would think, at least in a community like this, that somebody like you would be very valuable, because then it could get you to sort of check your priors, and obviously they're philosophy bros and they're all about that, at least rhetorically. So why weren't they more open to that kind of debate, even if they don't come to the same conclusions as you?
It's a good question. They do, profess to be interested in what they call crucial considerations, which is some consideration that would result in a very significant change in fundamental aspects of one's worldview. 180-degree turn, So this is something they explicitly are interested in discovering. But in practice, I think that they, part of it is that the community has become so wealthy and has made so many connections with, billionaires and other wealthy donors, that a significant pivot from their current path would have major consequences for funding. And so they've sort of put themselves in this situation where they don't have much wiggle room. An organization like the Global Priorities Institute, based at Oxford, which focuses on, the long-termist paradigm, as they put it, if it were to reject the long-termist paradigm, it's not clear how that institution would still exist. So there's a lot of institutional inertia, as it were, that I think prevented people from taking seriously some of the warnings that perhaps might have helped to identify Sam Bankman-Fried as a possible risk. After all, he's describing part of what he does as a Ponzi scheme.
Right. I mean, how much money did he pledge to fund towards the long-termist project and EA projects? I mean, like billions, right?
Billions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have an exact number, but it's an extraordinary amount of money. I think it made up, I should say, a good portion of the 46.1 billion that Effective Altruism had in committed funding as of, I don't know, a couple months ago. So,
it's
yeah. So,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's just it was really disappointing that the community wasn't more receptive. I think also, a lot of them come from a particular background, computer science, analytic philosophy, and so on, and as a result, don't have a good sense of the rest of the humanities. A lot of them haven't studied history, and so it becomes, I think, sort of easy for them to dismiss critiques that draw from, say, apocalypticism studies, or history, and so on. Well, we're different, and our decisions are based on really robust calculations using expected value theory, and long-termism draws a lot from economics. So there's a sense that actually the base, the foundation of their particular view really is quite robust. And they're so when I introduce my critiques, it's just like, that seems just out of left field and implausible. And so yeah, but it's very unfortunate that they didn't listen.
It's funny. I mean, it's been a long time since I've been in a classroom where you're sort of debating utilitarianism versus sort of deontological or virtue ethics or whatever the case may be. But like in a Philosophy 100 kind of lecture hall, even one that's filled with philosophy bros, I have never met anyone that has taken their utilitarianism to this sort of vulgar an extent. I mean, even people talk about rule-based utilitarianism, the sense of like having to respect certain kind of common sense moral intuitions, and having kind of mixed value systems and limitations, and obviously like recognizing the limitations of sort of technical knowledge and predictive abilities and probabilistic thinking. I mean, it seems like within lecture number 2, like you'd realize that this isn't This isn't so simple. I mean, being a good person isn't a math equation. That seems pretty intuitive to me, but not to them. I mean, are any of them like what are their backgrounds really? Are any of them philosophers proper? I mean, obviously Peter Singer is, but where do they come from?
Yeah, a lot of their backgrounds are philosophy.
Hmm.
I think I'm not 100% sure about this, but I believe this is the case that Toby Ord, who's one of the leading long-termists, his background was computer science.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there are many others in the community who are notable within the community to some extent, who have computer science backgrounds as well. So very quantitative
Mm-hmm.
way of thinking. As a result, utilitarian ethics is very appealing because you can, if there's a moral decision that has to be made, you can just crunch the numbers,
Right,
and figure out what is the rational and the moral thing to do. So yeah, there is. It's on, like you said. I mean, in a 101 course, the potential flaws of utilitarianism are noted,
mm-hmm.
such as utilitarianism instructs a doctor to kill one person in order to harvest the organs to save 5 other people. So by doing that act, again, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with murder on this view. By doing that, you would maximize the good because 5 healthy people and 1 dead person is a better situation than 1 healthy person and 5 people who've died. So yeah, I mean, there are just sort of obvious problems with this view, but I think there is a way that one can become sort of blinded by theory. I mean, if you spend all day around like-minded individuals, and the EA community has in the past placed a huge emphasis on value alignment. They they want community members, particularly individuals who are at the main organizations or institutes, to accept all of the fundamentals of the worldview, because it's just a waste of time trying to convince people of the truth or the plausibility of utilitarianism. So as a result, you get people who are very ideologically, very philosophically similar, and there's kind of philosophical homogeneity within these groups. And as a result, I think you can sort of become blinded by theory, and come to believe that the utilitarian view is perhaps more compelling, more cogent than it actually is.
What was this like for you to have, to be a part of this community? I don't know to what extent you were sort of enmeshed socially or whatever. I don't know how close you were to these people, but the way you described it, this was like a several year commitment to then have them, first of all, not be receptive, but second of all, just basically shun you. I mean, what was that like for you?
Yeah, I did know a lot of people in the community, and my thought was that if these various colleagues of mine are this kind of dogmatic about their view, then it's not worth having them as colleagues, because I would want people who are open to criticisms and interested in engaging with me or other critics in a productive debate. Because after all, my criticisms might be flawed in various ways. I want to know that. I'm open to criticism, and I think have proven that by doing my best to engage in conversation with these individuals. So yeah, it was kind of more than anything, it was just disappointing. I think because I had considered Effective Altruism to be an intellectual home for a time, and like, oh, finally I found a place where I belong, and yeah, and part of that was because precisely because they had said on so many occasions that they value critical discussion and critiques of their views and so on. So to discover that wasn't the case was just very disappointing. And like I said before, I mean, it just reinforced my suspicion that there's a kind of cultishness to the community. They're a bit dogmatic about some of their quasi-religious beliefs about the this techno-utopian future among the stars with astronomical numbers of people in computer simulations.
It is interesting how every article that I read about them, there's usually a quote where one of their adherents insists that they're not a cult.
Yeah.
What is it that makes them cultish?
I mean, on the one hand, it's what I was just mentioning, this sort of dogmatic adherence to certain tenets of the worldview, a reluctance to engage with critics, especially the individuals who provide the most trenchant and incisive critiques of their view. Also, I would say it has to the cultishness is associated with the fact that it's a very hierarchical community, and there's a lot of hero worship. So Will McCaskill would be an example of this, where a lot of people look up to him, and the fact that he's at the highest echelon of the epistocracy demands a kind of deference from underlings.
Do they explicitly use the epistocracy, like non-ironically?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think all of them use it, but definitely this is a term that's taken seriously,
right?
Used seriously by people in the community. So yeah, I think it's also this sort of the hero worship of these individuals who are seen as as especially bright, especially intelligent. IQ is something that matters a lot to many of these individuals, especially within the rationalist community, which is sort of overlaps very significantly with effective altruism. Eliezer Yudkowsky is another person where there's a lot of hero worship. He has, his following has been described as a cult following. So, yeah. So I mean, there's just many. Actually, one thing that an article that somebody should write at some point is looks at the various criteria that have been put forward by academics, forced a movement to qualify as a cult, and then see how many of those boxes the effective altruism community checks off. I suspect it would be very many.
You wrote a piece recently in Salon in which you tied the movement to eugenics, and something we haven't really discussed yet in the conversation. In what way do you see strains of eugenics thinking in EA and in long-termism?
Yeah, I think there are really two things to say about that. On the one hand, the long-termist worldview has very much sort of absorbed the transhumanist, a large portion of the transhumanist movement. I mean, Nick Bostrom was the most prominent transhumanist of the 21st century, along with Ray Kurzweil, I would say. The most prominent, the most influential. And transhumanism, there are critics, Robert Sparrows is an individual who comes to mind, who have argued, I think very convincingly, that if the transhumanist project were put into practice, the results would be more or less indistinguishable from what would happen if the old eugenics program were implemented. So, for example, there would be, homogenizing of society. So, Robert Sparrow has this thought experiment. Imagine that you're a parent and you have the option of modifying the various phenotypic characteristics of your child. How tall they are, perhaps how intelligent they are. There's a lot to say about that. It's not so simple in terms of the genetic basis of intelligence, but perhaps you could tweak genes in certain ways to modify these qualities. As a parent, let's say you live in a society exactly like ours, which is very racist in all sorts of ways, and as a parent, you cannot change the fact that society is racist. You can change by modifying the genes of your child, the color of their skin. So there's going to be a certain pressure to have children that are white. And in fact, if you're a parent, maybe you're looking around at all the other parents who are making the same decision. Maybe there's a certain high percentage of those parents who are saying, yeah, I should have a child who has white skin. So then there's even more pressure for you to do the same. Otherwise, in a racist society, you might disadvantage your child. And so the argument is ultimately you'd have then a bunch of people who are making decisions that result in whiteness becoming much more prevalent than it otherwise would have been. So in practice, transhumanism might lead to some very undesirable things. Rather than actually fostering diversity, as some of the transhumanists have argued, it might erase diversity. And I think when you then further contextualize this claim from Robert Sparrow in the fact that transhumanism can be traced back genealogically directly to the Anglo-American eugenics tradition, then it becomes even more sort of alarming. Like, oh, this isn't just a coincidence. It's not just by accident. Like, there's actually, there are roots of transhumanism in long-termism going back to Anglo-American eugenics. Julian Huxley would be the main character here. I mean, he was, a very enthusiastic advocate of eugenics throughout the 20th century, and even after World War II. And he was the one who popularized the term transhumanism. And the idea for him was to use, the methods of genetic control and genetic manipulation, i.e. eugenics, to not just perfect the human species and not just prevent us from degenerating, but also to perhaps even transcend ourselves. So if we, over many generations, if we keep promoting various traits that are desirable and demoting, traits that are undesirable, perhaps by preventing what they would call defectives from having children, then perhaps humanity could not just become like the best version of us possible, but we could become a superior race of post-humans, something like that. So this was his idea, and it's you can trace the lineage directly from Anglo-American eugenics through Julian Huxley to Nick Bostrom, and then right into long-termism.
I think it's also worth pointing out the demographics. It's probably no accident here. I mean, I think it's a movement that's 76% white, 71% male, might be the other way around. Those two stats, I can't remember exactly. But also, it seems like basically all of them are people at Oxford and now billionaires in Silicon Valley elites. So in this epistocracy is conveniently the very same people that are our financial and intellectual elites today, which has me wondering to what extent are we maybe taking it almost like too seriously, in the sense, is it genuine or is it cynical? Like, I mean, are these people in a sense trying to, because their views, in some sense are quite radical, but in another sense are very mundane, because they have this unflinching faith in technological progress and innovation and individual liberty and the market. So it seems like it is just exactly what financial elites want. It's kind of a, like in your own writing, right? As it's a kind of capitalist fever dream. So is it even a genuine intellectual project, or is it essentially something that's being used to kind of give cover for people like Elon Musk, SBF, and co. to continue their ways?
Yeah, it's a great question. First thing I would say is it could be genuine, I think. And, I mentioned before the sort of groupthink, the fact that the community is very homogenous in terms of its ideologies, ethical commitments, and so on. And so perhaps they don't realize the extent to which the transhumanist aspect, in particular, of the long-termist ideology is dangerous, or is essentially yet another iteration of what some scholars have called the eternal return of eugenics. Um, so my guess is that a lot of the major, most prominent exponents of this view really do believe in it. But it's a really interesting question about whether individuals like Elon Musk do. A lot of what he does, founding companies like Neuralink, co-founding OpenAI, SpaceX, even Tesla to some extent, make perfectly good sense when viewed through the lens of long-termism.
Right.
But it could also be that he has just this personal interest, this dream of, well, as he has put it before, to quote him, that he wants to die on Mars, just not on impact. So it's just, a lot of kids become enamored with this idea of space colonization. He's sort of a man-child with all this money, so maybe he wants to colonize Mars, ultimately for just kind of personal reasons. He just wants to go there. I guess is the idea behind space tourism in general, where billionaires who are going to be able to pay for this mostly. And then this ideology comes along, which dovetails perfectly with what he perhaps already wanted to do anyways. And so this can provide a kind of ethical pretext for what he was going to do already, and consequently make him look even better. I wanted to go to Mars long ago, but now actually there's this ethical framework that says going to Mars is what we should be doing.
Right.
Mars is a stepping stone to the rest of the universe, and the rest of the universe is where we create astronomical amounts of value.
Yeah, I should.
So
I mean, I think
it's hard to say.
It is hard to say. When I ask a question like that, I should say, I mean, it strikes me that it's never one or the other. Like, it is, in a sense, these people could be thoroughly genuine in their convictions, but it just so happens that their material interests push them towards pursuing certain questions and ostracizing people who ask the questions they don't like because of all the money that's involved, because it's just such a break to really challenge their own way of life. But I'm interested in kind of maybe to sort of wrap up here, because to ask us a generous question of EA and of long-termism, it does feel to me that, of course, all of us feel this sense of existential risk and ontological sort of insecurity. And we also struggle with how to be good people. And, anybody who has gone, anywhere through the academic discipline of philosophy, you will see quite quickly that that is not a discipline that is very often asking you how to be a good person. They're sort of wrapped up in interminable technical debates about various theoretical frameworks and not really there to help you develop your own practical wisdom. Also, I think there's a sociological context here of the fact that people don't go to religion anymore. People are atomized and alone. So it's not really self-evident how to be a good person. And in the context of the existential risk that we feel, they came along, and I think they filled a void. And I think a lot of people probably that get attracted to this movement get attracted for very probably admirable reasons. And who else is asking the question? So I just want to get your sense on that. But also, if not them, where does one go to sort of address issues of the sort that they are addressing?
Yeah, great questions. I do think that transhumanism and now long-termism do fill the same sort of role that religion had. In fact, I mean, speaking of Julian Huxley, he was talking about essentially the idea of transhumanism going back to the early 20th century, not just after World War II. And one of the books in which he discussed this idea was revealingly titled "Religion Without Revelation." So it was about this, secular humanist worldview that could provide one with meaning, that could give one a certain kind of hope for the future, that atheists or agnostics, have lost because religion became during the 19th century increasingly implausible. And even Bostrom himself, in this very long document that he wrote with the help of many other transhumanists, called the Transhumanist Fact, Frequently Asked Questions, published in 1999, he also mentions that transhumanism is essentially modern day religion, rather than relying on supernatural agency to usher in this utopian world in the future. It's us. It's our responsibility. It's our ingenuity that is going to enable us to, in this world, in this life, create this a utopian world. So there is as a result, a kind of seductiveness to it. I certainly can relate with it. The long-termist vision, it's this grand view of what we could become. The idea that we live in the hinge of history, the time of perils, one of the most important moments of human history, when we decide whether we go extinct or whether civilization collapses irreversibly, or we begin to colonize space, starting with Mars and so on. That's sort of up to us. So this is a pivotal moment on this view that, as a result, can give one a very powerful sense of meaning. That astronomical value might, whether or not this is realized or foreclosed forever, might depend on what I do today, what you do today. So there's something very appealing about that for atheists, and I think if one then abandons the long-termist view, one thing I would say is that the other two cause areas that effective altruists focus on, I think, are good. I think there are reasons to be critical of certain aspects of EA. Some of the frameworks they use, the fact that much of the literature is built on a utilitarian ethics or draws from utilitarianism in some way. Lots of stuff to criticize, but the two main cause areas, global poverty, animal welfare, I think are very good ones. And there is this question that EA addresses, which sort of goes beyond any particular ethical theory. And it's just the question of, look, even if I have, have met all of my moral obligations, if I just want to do good in the world, if I just want to be an altruist, if I want to help others, how do I do that? And EA does at least, provide, I think, maybe the most charitable thing to say is they provide, a path to at least sort of exploring that in a somewhat rigorous way. So I don't think all of EA should be demolished. I don't think it should be razed to the ground. I think long-termism is extremely dangerous, particularly radical long-termism, and that I'm very much worried about. But EA in general, I think, does have some problems, but overall, there is a lot within EA that is worth salvaging.
Yeah, it strikes me that there's philosophical critiques. There's no kind of one individual sort of quantitative metric to measure the good, capital T, capital G, and we can talk about sort of the strange traps that a kind of vulgar utilitarianism puts you in. But I will, to their credit, say that being a good person is a difficult thing that requires intellectual and moral courage and commitment. And to the extent that EA can sort of shake you from just fulfilling the intuitive moral obligations around you, and that's that. I mean, that's a good thing, I think. But yeah, you're right. If it leads one inevitably to this, that's not a good thing. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't inevitably lead one to this. And maybe this is just a very bizarre pathological outgrowth of it. But I don't know.
I don't think there's anything inevitable. about accepting EA and then ending up at long-termism.
Mm.
And I know that there are plenty of people in the community who have really pushed back against the long-termist cause area. And I think that's a good thing. It's very promising. And yeah, like you said, I mean, it's tough to figure out what the best thing to do. I do, you know, I am sympathetic with this idea that we should try to be as rigorous as possible in deciding where our finite resources go. It may very well be the case that anti-malarial bed nets, maybe that's the best way to save the lives of other humans in the world, rather than perhaps spending it on disaster relief. Even though disaster relief has a stronger pull, a stronger tug of the heart than bed nets. Yeah, when you crunch the numbers, it does seem compelling that perhaps bed nets is the best way to go. I myself, am committed to donating basically everything I make over 35,000 euros a year. So, yeah, and some of when I decide to donate, some of the EA suggestions are useful as points of reference.
Mm.
But I mean, besides that, I mean, EA is not just a philosophy; it's a movement as well. And I think there's all sorts of serious problems with the movement, like we were saying before. It is very cultish, but you do not need to be a member of the movement to look at the philosophy and say, oh, there's something, worthwhile here. So long as it doesn't lead one to long-termism, to see the loss, quote unquote loss of, all these future people in computer simulations as some kind of massive moral tragedy that we should avoid at pretty much any cost.
Well, Emilie P. Torres, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much. It's been such a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.